Digital piracy has been a rampant issue since the 1980s, when software was first distributed on these floppy-ass disks. One of the most popular pieces of software back in the 80s was Microsoft Word. And fellas, if you've ever taken Word for a spin, you know the unparalleled adrenaline rush of typing both letters and words on a virtual screen. But there was one stinking problem. Microsoft Word wasn't free. No, Bill Gates and the thieves at Microsoft were charging users $498 US for a license. And in modern currency, that's like 60,000 V-Bucks. Now, don't get me wrong, I love typing in Word as much as the next guy, but that price is criminally insane. I mean, I could do $497, but $498? But luckily, there was a workaround. Piracy, which had been dormant since the 1700s, was about to make the most epic gamer comeback. Consumers who were itching to get their fix of Microsoft's word processing gameplay figured out a way to crack open the software, bypass the software's copy protection measures, and access the sentence spelling madness that they had packed away inside. And thus began the rise of cracked software. What idiot would pay $500 for Word when you could just crack the software and use it for free? But there is an obvious problem. When consumers start getting the software for free, companies start to lose money. And when companies start to lose money, the US government starts to get pissed. So when consumers started making corporations sad with their theft, the US government had to figure out a way to cheer them up. And the solution? Jail time. Man, the US prison system really is a fix for everything, huh, guys? And so began a new era of piracy. Nefarious computer scientists would crack open software as quickly as companies could make it, and the government would arrest anyone who so much as looked at the software wrong. It was truly a beautiful cycle. And this would continue for generations and generations, coming to a real crescendo in the era of LimeWire and becoming a bit less of an issue with the release of streaming services, which has become its own bubbling mess, but that's not what we're here to talk about in the slightest. No, if you know Meraki, you know that I'm what the kids would call a gamer, right before they politely ask me not to sit at their lunch table. But as a seasoned gamer, I know that the land of video game piracy is an entirely different beast. You see, game developers are smart, and they know that the threat of jail is laughable in the eyes of a true gamer. No, developers took a much more clever approach to combating piracy in their games. Of course, gamers aren't afraid of jail, so how do you threaten such a brave and fearless species? To the devs, the answer was right in front of them the whole time. You poisoned the game itself. By uploading contaminated versions of the game to popular piracy websites, game studios are able to ensure that gamers that are up to no good accidentally download a copy that they've intentionally tampered with. Through gameplay modifications, shame, guilt, and even elements of horror, developers have been subtly winning the war on video game piracy, while their counterparts in the film, software, and music industry have been struggling for years. Today, we're going to explore the twisted world of video game anti-piracy. So there's a few avenues that game developers take to combat piracy in their games, but the first I want to drive down is the technique of shame. Later, we'll get into the comedic and the horrifying anti-piracy techniques, but similarly to how I start every day on this cruel earth, I think we should experience some shame first. In these games, developers have altered code focused on having the criminal experience deep-seated shame, either by rubbing it in their face through the game itself, or through subtle psychological subversions that cause the culprit to wander onto the web and accidentally reveal onto the world their dubious deed. And looking back, one of the earliest examples of game shame was in Earthbound, released in '94 for the Super NES. And some of you may know the game itself, others of you might know the game through the annoying-ass Smash characters, but either way, it was a massive hit back in the 90s. And these were early days for video game piracy, but fans were adamant that they didn't want to pay the $70 price tag. And devs knew that this elevated price tag was certain to drive some of these fans to piracy, so they got up to no good. They got up to no good at all. When users loaded up a pirated copy of the game, they'd quickly find that the game was way harder than they had expected. They would get in more combat encounters, they would face more difficult enemies, and they would spend a lot more time fighting than the average player. What's more, the text on the screen would be oddly difficult to read, becoming, in a technical sense, garbled. But let's say you were able to overcome the garbled text and the tedium of endless waves of enemies. Let's say you were able to evade the intentional crashing sequences the devs hard-coded into the pirated copies. Let's say, against all odds, that you were about to make it to the game's final boss in the pirated copy, ready to PK fire his socks off. Well, after hours of intentionally increased effort, the game would just wipe your progress right before the final battle. You would be left staring at your dumb reflection in the TV's black glass, forcing you to come to terms with the fact that you had just wasted hours of your life just because you refused to support the hard work of dozens of skilled artists and developers. And even though they technically let the players experience 99% of the game for free, that's truly the worst place to stop a game at right before the finale. I mean, who would do that? Who in their right mind would do that? But for some games, they wanted to ensure that the shame was public. In Gary's mod, The Sandbox Extravaganza that brought us Prop Hunt, the game's creator himself, Gary Newman, took matters into his own hands. Gary programmed a special message into pirated copies that stated the ambiguous phrase, "unable to shade polygon normals," along with an intricate error code. And when players saw this, they naturally took to Reddit, the forums. I mean, some of these guys even probably went to Quora to seek help. And let's be honest, if you're going to Quora, you probably should be seeking help. But when players went to post their pleas for help, they might notice something odd. Their Steam notifications would begin to pile up. Friend requests, comments on their profiles, maybe even rogue trade offers. But it turns out that the error code wasn't so erroneous after all. It was actually a string of numbers and letters that exposed the pirate's Steam account. It makes sense that the sick mind of someone that would allow poor inanimate objects to hunt each other would come up with a sinister ruse like this, but I have to say that I'm glad Gary did this. After all, public shame is one of the great American pastimes. But some games kept the shame a bit more simple. In Alan Wake, for example, pirated copies just kind of pasted an eye patch over your character, meaning any screenshots you shared or if you were playing with friends, they would know that you're a villainous little rascal. But the final and most meta of them all comes from a game about the development process itself. Game Dev Tycoon was released for just $8 on PC, but a day after release, the devs realized that a legitimately staggering 97% of copies that were in play were pirated versions. So they went back to the studio the next day to make a couple of edits to their code and throw it up on one of the popular pirating websites. Now in Game Dev Tycoon, pirates would be able to play normally for hours. The fake game would be nearly identical to the real game in all aspects, letting players create and release these little games to their little audiences to their heart's content. But out of nowhere, the game studios in the pirated version would start hemorrhaging money. Your sales would start to fall. It made no sense. Your games were being received well, the reviews were great. Hell, Markiplier even did a Let's Play, but despite all this, you just couldn't sell copies. And then you'd be hit with a message. Your sales were falling because your game had been cracked, and people were playing a pirated version, which was driving revenue away from your studio. And it was the perfect and most hilarious way to shame the pirates who couldn't support the indie duo with just $8, because the idiots who were playing the cracked version still managed to go to the forums and complain about the unfair and overpowered pirating mechanic. Some of the stupidest pirates even asked if it would be possible to add a DRM, which is basically anti-pirating software, to the game, despite literally circumnavigating the DRM themselves. And yeah, I know that sounded weird, so circumnavigating will definitely be the longest word I say today. Shame is such a classic anti-piracy technique in games, and I always love to see pirates exposing their own behavior out of their own stupidity. I think it's pretty hilarious and genius that devs would rather release a near full experience that ridicules the player instead of just releasing these broken versions onto popular pirating platforms. I think it's just like our mothers taught us. Shame is a powerful tool. But some game studios like to take things in a more lighthearted direction, and they aim to make cracked versions of the game that are a bit less subtle in their antics and more funny haha. Of course, some games keep it simple, like GTA 4 or Arma 2, whose cracked copies make your screen look like your character just railed 19 tequila shots before hitting the town. In Arma, they'll also just start filling your screen with Arma 2 logos, which is oddly similar to my experience when drinking. One of the most obvious examples in this category is from Crisis Warhead. The devs at Crysis, the hilariously unoptimized series known for making computers explode with its ridiculous spec requirements, decided to upload a version of the game where every gun you shoot fires chickens instead of bullets. And gamers, that is some foul play. Get them off the screen. And unlike in real life, these chickens did no damage to enemies, so you would have to punch enemies to death, which would make the game nearly unplayable. But if you ask me, the real anti-piracy with the Crysis games was their sloppy optimization. The second funny anti-piracy technique I wanted to talk about comes from the devs over at the Sims series. In Sims 4, most of you probably know that when your sim goes to the bathroom or goes to shower, we get a pixelated view of their private area. Damn, no balls today. But if you downloaded a particular pirated version of the game, the pixelation would stick around after leaving the bathroom. And it would continue to spread like a contagion until finally your entire screen was just a pixelated mess. And to be fair, I think this is absolutely justified because The Sims is so fairly priced. I mean, I personally feel such a true sense of pride and accomplishment when I empty my retirement fund to purchase their half-baked expansion packs. But before we get into the final section of the video, we have to talk about one of my favorite series of all time, The Witcher. As fans of the series may know, Geralt is a bit of a playboy. And if you manage to nail the dialogue options like a truly elite gamer, you find yourself stumbling into a particularly raunchy cutscene. But the pirated version of the game came with two caveats. First, the game would just randomly pause and then cut to a cutscene of Geralt getting brutally murdered. But as if that wasn't bad enough, there was another, more depraved way that the devs would torture the pirates. You remember those raunchy scenes I alluded to 20 seconds ago? Congrats, here's a gold star for the day. Go show it off in the comments. So when you finally got to one of these cutscenes expecting to be met with Yen or with Triss, you'd be met with an alternate maiden. One that was a bit older, a bit rounder, and as if that wasn't enough, a bit less well regarded by the community due to her affiliation with Witcher's drug ring. And it wasn't the cleanest edit, but the scenes would play out in their entirety, leaving pirates to rip the eyes from their sockets and sit in the regret of not purchasing the full game. Funny anti-piracy is great because it keeps things nice and light, which I think actually might be more effective at convincing pirates to buy the game. If gamers like one thing, it's a good joke, and developers who are able to poke fun at pirates while subtly telling them to pay for the game are likely to be getting the best of both worlds. But now we get to the category I know you've all been waiting for, you sick bastards. The games where developers wouldn't keep things lighthearted at all. They wouldn't even try to shame you. They would try their best to scare you to your very core. And of course, horror is subjective, and I'm sure some of you are extremely brave and can't wait to brag about how games with horror or creepy anti-piracy aren't scary. But just to set the scene here, imagine you're playing this game alone in your room at night with absolutely no expectation that the game would have horror elements. Like, some of these games are Nintendo games whose typical idea of horror is just a cartoon ghost. Oh, holy shit. Anyways, the first I wanted to mention is from a game that is usually lighthearted, despite its serious name. In Serious Sam, you fight waves of enemies as Sam Serious Stone. And despite being advertised as serious, get this, it's all a satirical ruse, and the game is actually lighthearted. The enemies are pretty easy to kill, and it's much more of an arcade-style game than a combat simulator. That is, unless you pirate the game. For the pirating scallywags, you'll find yourself not as the hunter, but as the hunted. Developers coded in an infamous enemy into pirated copies. A nightmarish arachnid that was incredibly fast, invincible, and had just one mission: to end your life. Imagine you're just walking around the levels, having fun, not knowing when you're gonna get jumped by a demonic creature. It's like the video game version of Columbus, Ohio. And this anti-piracy was actually received very well by the community. So well, in fact, that some madman actually took it upon himself to beat the entire game while being hunted by this invincible, bloodthirsty creature. But funnily enough, it was the older games, like really old games, that took the horror and creepiness to the next level. In Gold Rush, you play as Jared Wilson, a prospector who travels to California during the gold rush of 1849 with hopes of striking it big. And even though the game came out in the 1980s, the game was still running into some pirating issues. But rather than releasing modified versions online, which was a bit harder to do in this era, the developers intentionally coded a sequence into the game that required the game's manual to complete. You'd be asked a question that was intended to be easy if you had the box, and you could grab the manual and reference it for the correct response. But if you answered wrong, the developers deemed you to be a pirate. And the sequence that ensued was a bit more intense than I had ever expected. You'd suddenly be led out into a field with these eerie pixelated faces staring right at your soul. And in the middle of the screen, there was a platform, and above, there was a noose hanging from a tree. The game would call you a coward, and you'd walk up to be legitimately hanged. You'd even have a chance to type out your last words, which is just really gruesome and bone-chilling, especially given that this was a game that was aimed at a younger audience. But imagine you're someone who bought the game and just lost the manual, or maybe you typed in the response one letter wrong. I know it was the 80s, but I really think this game took it a bit too far. But the most terrifying anti-piracy screens in existence have a bit of a caveat. They're either unconfirmed, meaning that the copy with the modifications has been removed from the pirating site, or perhaps was uploaded by modders rather than the devs themselves, or in some cases, they're fan-made. Some are more obviously fake, like this Mario Kart Wii one, or the Pokemon game just threatening your death if you don't buy the game. But perhaps my favorite anti-piracy screen of all time, real or fake, is from Animal Crossing New Horizons. And this one is fan-made, but it is so well done that it really feels real. This comes from YouTuber Timmy versus Tommy, who has actually made dozens of amazing anti-piracy screens for Animal Crossing. And they're great because they feel true to the game, like KK Slider singing a song about how you're a terrible person, or the Able Sisters putting you in a prison uniform and telling you that's what you should look like, you miserable piece of shit. But the best of them all comes in at the Roost, which is typically this cozy, safe space for Animal Crossing players. Actually, this whole game is just a cozy ass experience, a real break from the outside world. And I think that's what made this anti-piracy especially hit home for me, as someone who experienced this game during the global pandemic and who really relied on it to be an escape from a very scary and horrifying outside world, which is just what makes this so unsettling. So I want you to imagine that you're playing another day on your lovely island. It's probably the morning time and you've just rolled over in bed, grabbed your Switch, and we're just gonna enjoy some cozy crossing with your morning tea. And then you start doing your morning routine in Animal Crossing, like the good little Pavlovian dog that Nintendo wants you to be. You hit your rocks, you check your shops, and you head to Brewster's for some coffee to chill out and have a nice moment of rest. You jump scare Blathers and you head to the Roost. Your ears are brought to life by that majestic piano track, and you walk up to take your usual seat. Brewster starts chatting to you in that deep vibrato that you've come to love, and oh boy, what a treat. Brewster has a special cup just for us. I guess it's our lucky day. But after sliding the cup across the table, Brewster tells us that we've been bad. In fact, we've been very, very bad, and we have to drink the coffee. Your questions go unanswered, but Brewster repeats his command. You take a sip, but something doesn't feel right. Suddenly, this dissonant track plays, and the camera pans to reveal sockets in the place of your eyes. Your mouth becomes a black square, either covered by tape or removed entirely. And as you try to run away, he stops you. Your game crashes, your account is blocked. You fall out of bed, you spill your tea, Bowser's at your door. Now, when I first saw this, I thought it was real. I didn't have the full context, and even though I wasn't the one playing, it seriously creeped me out. And the next time I went to play Animal Crossing on my own, I had the heebie-jeebies. I avoided Brewster entirely because even though I was playing on a legitimate copy, I promise, I was worried that, maybe he'd serve me this poisoned cup of coffee. And I know Nintendo's not that type of company, but I really wish there was a world in which they would hire this creator to help their dev team upload anti-piracy copies with these kinds of hijinks in them. Not only would it be effective anti-piracy, but I just know that the fan base would explode if these were real. And I think that would be a beautiful thing. Anti-piracy is such an interesting topic because it really is something that can only be done in games. Games are the only medium where the developers can actively fight back at the pirates. And I think this whole phenomenon of contaminated copies being uploaded to the popular sites and pirates getting hoodwinked by game developers is just an incredible battle, and I'm glad it's taking place. Now, I want to take a moment here to make it clear that piracy is a very nuanced topic. And it's different when you're pirating a game that's not being sold anymore versus a game that came out now. And it's different when you're pirating a game from an indie dev just trying to make it versus an international media conglomerate. But at the end of the day, even at these big companies, the developers and creatives who worked on the games rely on the game's performance for their bonuses and salaries. So while you might be justifying your piracy by saying you're boycotting one of the big companies, and sure, these greedy companies do keep most of the money, but just keep in mind that you do hurt the developers and the creative employers who actually made the game as well. So yeah, I don't expect you to pull out a Babylonian map of the world to track down an old copy of Ocarina of Time, but please remember that when you pirate a game, it hurts the developers. And this may come as a shock, but game developers have to eat too. And so do I. So because I know you pirating freeloaders got this video for free, please smash that like button and subscribe, and maybe I can eat, not this week, but the next. Anyways, thanks for watching, and until next time, this has been Meraki. Bye-bye.